From claiming to have back-engineered extraterrestrial flying saucers, to having a massive headache when confronted with serious questions about his story, if there's someone on this planet who's an interesting character, it's for sure Bob Lazar. For those interested in the study of UFOs, Lazar's story is one that has stood out the most. From having people doubt his story to giving almost exact details about Area 51, his story is damn near a Hollywood spectacle, with most of the UFO community positively weighing in on his accounts. I've always believed Lazar. You can't listen to his entire 3-hour story and then tell someone you think it's all crap. Between the bone scanner biometrics he's mentioned and the intense details of some moments is insane, and to keep the exact same story for over 30 years is godlike. While Bobby seems to have stuck with the same story for over 30 years, his appearance on the Joe Rogan podcast had others wondering about the validity of his claims. In a Joe Rogan subreddit post titled "Why Does Rogan Believe Bob Lazar?", poster Jack Frost71 would lay out a pretty detailed description of Lazar with one comment by Caitlin's old balls stating, "As soon as the migraine excuses came out when he was on, I had to discount a lot of what he said. As soon as he was pushed to explain inconsistencies, he clammed up. It's a shame that a lot of people believed he was on the level for such a long time." Now, I won't lie to the wonderful UFO community. I am in no way, shape, or form a disinformation agent. I mean, those guys sound like they make a 6-figure income. And if they do, where the hell do I apply? But seriously, I am a firm believer that we are not alone in this universe, and Bob Lazar's story captured me when I was really into the UFO topic. But after several views of Joe Rogan's close to 3-hour podcast with the man, the migraine card threw me off as well.
Turned on and what was discovered about it. I'm sorry, the migraine is really making it hard for me to think here.
Sorry.
It was as if Lazar was nervous on arguably the biggest podcast in the world, trying to make sure he got his story straight. And Jeremy, please, put that fucking mic to your mouth.
Look at how
Pull this microphone up to your face. Give me about a fist from your face.
All right.
I'm
sorry, man.
It's literally with these migraines that had me questioning the man I once found very credible. And ladies and gentlemen, his real story is a wild one. And that's not even talking about the Area S4 stuff. Welcome to the Scotch. Grab your Element 115 and watch as my fancy was literally tickled into analyzing the many claims of Bob Lazar. Robert Scott Lazar was essential when it came to Area 51 coming to the public's eye. The first time Lazar appeared on the news was with investigative reporter George Knapp in May of 1989, who was introduced to Bob by the famous pilot John Lear. Before Bob Lazar was making these claims of working at Area S4, Lear was way ahead of the game when it came to exposing our government's cover-up of extraterrestrial beings. After his first interview with George Knapp, John Lear would meet a man who would take him out into the Nevada desert, alleging secret government UFO test flights near Papoose Lake. He'd been given the information of these test flights by his buddy Bob Lazar, who'd claimed to have worked out at Area 51, mainly the S4 region where he was given this secret flight schedule. 2 months after he introduced his friends to these UFOs, Lazar would come forward disclosing his involvement in the back engineering of extraterrestrial technology out at Area S4. Shortly thereafter, Lazar would become fearful of his life that he decided to come forward by revealing his face in an even more in-depth interview with George Knapp. His reasoning for revealing himself? Well, if he were to mysteriously disappear, it would be validation enough to prove his story was the truth.
The second question is that if all I've just presented to you is true and the government is keeping this a secret, how can I make a video telling you about it? Well, the bottom line is, if there are any repercussions from making this video, it would simply confirm that what I told you is true. So what you do with this information is up to you.
After his story went viral, virtually everyone with a television program wanted a piece of this guy's story. Lazar would even put out a lengthy video explaining how exactly these flying saucers worked, and would go into even greater detail about what exactly was at Area S4.
As part of my indoctrination into the program at S4, I would randomly be taken into a small room which contained a table, a chair, and 120 or so briefings in blue folders. These reports appeared to be an overview of alien information which can be used to brief scientists from any field about the scope of the whole project, and not just their specific field of endeavor.
Now, I am in no way, shape, or form a scientist, merely a guy who likes to find out information. But as an outsider to anything science-related, Lazar really does sound like he knows what he's talking about. Comments under his testimonial video believe Lazar to be nothing short of an American hero. I've been an engineer for the last 42 years. This guy talks like every engineer and scientist I've ever met. What he says about modern physics is true as far as I know it. It kind of blows your mind. Bob Lazar is, and he would probably deny this, an anchor in human history as nothing more than a conduit for the light of truth. He managed to bring forth the truth to the public without getting himself murdered in the process, which in my opinion is a testament to his intuition and intellect. Thank you, Bob, if you ever read this. Element 115 should be renamed Lazarium. It's interesting to note that the element that propelled these saucers was virtually unknown until Lazar came forward explaining its properties. It wasn't on the periodic table up until 2016 and is an extremely radioactive element known as moscovium. Lazar eventually knew he fucked up by coming out with this information, not only breaking his majestic clearance, but also being at risk of possibly disappearing out in the vast Nevada desert. The guy sounded like the real deal. He'd claimed to have had degrees down from MIT to Caltech that no one ever found records of, and even worked out at Los Alamos National Laboratory, which there were some records of that would be dug up by reporter George Knapp. But why can't many people find his education records or consistent birth documents? Well, Lazar has a perfectly good explanation as to why that may be.
We called Los Alamos again. An exasperated official told us he still had no records on Lazar. EG&G, which is where Lazar says he was interviewed for the job at S4, also has no records. It's as if someone has made him disappear.
Well, they're trying to make me a non-person.
Explain. You called where?
Well, the schools that I went to, the hospital that I was born at, past job, and essentially nothing comes up with my name in it.
He smiles, but out of futility, knowing the whole thing must sound ridiculous.
It does seem pretty feasible that secret government programs would go out of their way to delete someone's history in order to protect their most valuable secrets. In an article titled Bob Lazar Shadows, Signal S Intelligence writes that Alan Rothberg, a childhood friend of Lazar, was interviewed about his experience and memories of Bob. Alan stated this about Lazar: "I'm going to say after high school I would say it's pretty much self-taught, as far as I know. I don't believe he ever got any formal education. I don't know if he ever went to a college. I don't know that he's gotten any degrees, or he probably has certificates because, for example, to be a fireworks demonstrator. Again, the Caltech story is a bit surprising to me, but physics? I doubt he ever got a degree in physics. To me, that involves far more abstract math. Bob's research was almost entirely practical application when I knew him. He did stuff like, I can make this happen, so this is what I'm going to get into. But matrix manipulation for math, higher level math or theoretical, not a chance. I shouldn't say not a chance. I do not see it. But again, who knows what happened after we parted ways. It's no secret that Bob Lazar's intelligence plays a major role in the validation of his stories, even having his childhood buddies question whether or not Bob is telling the truth. But what is the truth? What is the truth behind the person who brought these revelations to the public eye? It's very hard to discredit someone's story when the person telling them is the only one with the information to back it up. Oh yeah, and a newspaper article and phone book entry that George Knapp was able to dig up. But let's take it back some years before he ended up in the Nevada desert. Hell, let's take it back to when he first arrived at Los Alamos, because the factual side of Bob Lazar's story may be even more wild than the alien side of it. With the help of the Robert Lazar timeline by Tom Mayhood, along with well-written investigations done by Signal S Intelligence on the Medium website, here are some events that caught my attention that are almost certain the true story of Bob Lazar. Let's start with an incident that happened with Lazar's first wife, Carol Strong, who also goes by Carol Asher and Carol Eastlinger. On June 12, 1974, Carol Nadine Eastlinger and two associates, Gary Burkett, a member of the Oakland chapter of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, and his wife Victoria, entered the home of Dennis Passero. Mr. Passero and Mrs. Burkett had allegedly gotten into a violent argument weeks prior. Carol held a guest of Passero's, Eugene Day, at gunpoint in an adjacent room while the other two stabbed and shot Mr. Passero to death. After Passero had been killed, the attackers handcuffed Day to a shelf bracket and handed him a syringe, which he was told contained a solution that would incapacitate him. At some point, Day was able to throw a wall plaque at Carol and escape to a neighbor's house where he contacted authorities. The following day, Carol would be arrested following a routine tow truck call in which she would be found in her Cadillac asleep with a 15-year-old boy. Upon their arrival, the police officers awakened Carol and the boy and conducted a search of the car. During the search, they discovered amphetamine powder and tablets, as well as stolen goods. Both were promptly arrested and charged with possession of dangerous drugs and possession of property with altered serial numbers. She would be sentenced in 1975 for a minimum of 5 years for second-degree murder, to which it seems she was released only 2 years later in 1977. It was around this time that Bob Lazar had moved out to California with his parents and attended Pierce College. Only a few years later, in July of 1980, Bob and Carol would get married with their marriage license stating they were both electronics engineers, with the highest school grade completed being 12th grade. In June of 1982, Bob Lazar is featured in the Los Alamos Monitor, with author Terry England stating Lazar was a physicist at the Los Alamos Mason Physics Facility, though with Signal S Intelligence's research, whether or not England had made any efforts to verify that Lazar was in fact a physicist at Los Alamos has been debated ever since. Now, there is clear evidence of Lazar working out at Los Alamos, and yes, he is featured in the lab directory, though an actual physicist named John Jarmer was also interviewed by Signal S Intelligence, with Jarmer stating this about Lazar: "When I was at Los Alamos at the lab working, he did some electrical technician work that I'm aware of. There was no reference to him ever having a background in physics. If he does, he should be able to put forth his degree credentials, wherever they're from." 1982 would be the year that Lazar alleges he received degrees from prestigious universities. Let's examine where Lazar claims to have gotten these degrees, because a person name-dropping schools like MIT and Caltech is a person who wants notoriety. Anyone who believes Bob Lazar believes a guy who tells a crowd at Rachel in 1993 that he had Professors Duxler and Hosfield at MIT and Caltech. Neither were found to have taught at MIT or Caltech. Stan Friedman found them to be Bob's high school and Pierce College teachers, for which there is record of Bob attending. MIT and Caltech also told Friedman that Bob had not attended either school.
I did a lot of checking on Bob. I tried to meet with him twice. I was supposed to on one occasion, and he didn't go along. I checked at MIT. I checked at Caltech. Neither one ever heard of him. Well, but the government wiped his records clean is the response. I talked to the legal counsel at MIT. No way to do that. I talked with the guy who has the degrees, the commencement lists and all that sort of thing. No mention of Lazar.
Remember, Bob claims they were trying to make him non-existent. But here's an interesting comment posted under the Stan Friedman video of Bob Lazar. "I had a part-time job at the registrar's office at my undergrad university, which stored the physical paper transcripts and file cabinets in a walk-in safe. Those paper transcripts could easily have been lifted. I had full access to them myself, as I had to reference them as part of my work. But here's the thing. I also have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree. If I had to prove that I earned those degrees, I wouldn't bother with requesting copies of my transcripts. I'd just show the diplomas that are hanging on the wall in my office. Sure, those could have been forged, but I'd at least have them to show as evidence. Are we to believe that Bob has the degrees but not the diplomas? It would be the first thing that any of us would show as evidence." While Stan Friedman did the heavy lifting when it came to discovering Lazar's academic credentials, Bob's longtime friend and the first person to come out with his story, George Knapp, also denies Lazar's claims of ever attending MIT and Caltech.
And I will confide to you this. I don't believe he ever went to those schools. I don't believe Bob Lazar could get a degree from Caltech or MIT for a very simple reason. You have to take all kinds of core courses in subjects that you may not be interested in. I can't imagine Bob Lazar sitting through a class in American Lit or reading poetry or something like that. He'd never stand for it. So what do we do? What do we do with that? Do we throw out the story? Here's how I rationalize it, is Bob would not be the first person to lie about his educational credentials in order to get a good job.
Though he doesn't believe Lazar's educational background, Knapp still maintains his belief in Bob's story. It was also in 1982 that Lazar claimed to have met the father of the hydrogen bomb, Edward Teller.
And if I ask you on camera if you know Bob Lazar, can you just say no?
I will sit silently.
But the only evidence we have to suggest this allegation is Bob's account of Teller reading the exact newspaper article of his jet engine car. Let's jump to October of 1983, where Bob and Carol opened a photo processing shop called Studio West. And as early as 1984, Lazar claimed to have opened a brothel called Honeysuckle Ranch, with an excerpt from his autobiography stating, "We were doing well financially. We'd even invested in a legalized brothel in Las Vegas that was taking in $100,000 a month at the time we purchased it for $1 million. The Honeysuckle Ranch had been in business for more than 30 years. Though no record of a Honeysuckle Ranch has ever been found, people knowing Lazar back at Los Alamos recall Bob as an individual who had left New Mexico after borrowing hundreds of thousands of dollars and not repaying his debts. The following is part of a transcript of a recorded telephone interview that took place on May 25, 1996 between Mark Farmer and an individual who knew Robert Lazar when he was at Los Alamos, New Mexico. Bob's not a stupid person. He's very intelligent. He's also very clever and kind of a little bit of a con man, I guess you'd say. He's always got something going, but he is very intelligent. Right after I loaned him the money, him and Carol had claimed that they had bought a bordello in Nevada. Okay. And that they were operating this bordello going back and forth. Had a madam running it for them, and they would sell t-shirts and things with the bordello's name here in the shop in Los Alamos. And I did a little checking on that, and I found out that there was no business registered under that name. And so that's when I started to figure out a lot of the things he was telling me, at least about his personal life and business dealings, was untrue. But technically, he seemed to be fairly sharp. He opened a second photo processing store called Film West in 1985, and in early 1986 would file for bankruptcy, in which Bob Lazar abruptly closed down Studio West. John Horn, a friend of Bob's who had loaned him $2,000 for the purchase of a jet dragster, describes the speed of Bob's departure. Yeah, and he had declared bankruptcy. He skipped out on all his debts in town. He owed probably about $60,000 to Los Alamos National Bank for the photo processing equipment. He just skipped out on that. After fleeing Los Alamos, Bob ended up in Nevada, where on April 19, 1986, he'd married Tracy Ann Merck, who was working in the photo lab Carol and Bob operated out in Los Alamos. Now, wait a minute. He'd married Tracy Ann all while still being married to his first wife, Carol. So what happened to Carol after finding out Bob married one of their employees? According to the police report, on April 21st, 1986, at about 7:35, Bob Lazar returned to his residence and found his wife apparently deceased in her vehicle in the garage of the residence. Medical and police personnel were requested and responded and found the deceased an apparent victim of a suicide. Carol's cause of death would be carbon monoxide asphyxiation, pending an autopsy. It's also interesting to note that the death could have occurred between the 19th and 21st of April, according to the police report, when Bob was actually in town at the We've Only Just Begun wedding chapel in Las Vegas on the 19th, marrying Tracy. The police record would further indicate that Bob Lazar stated he was out of town pursuing his occupation as a race car driver, and when he returned home today, he found his wife deceased. A note is found inside of the house, and basically it says that she is tired of it. She wanted no funeral, no flowers, cremation, and it said, "I did it by myself," and is signed from Carol Lazar. Lazar's bankruptcy case would be finalized on March 19, 1987, with the final accounting showing $173,000 in assets and $270,000 in debts. He'd meet John Lear sometime around 1988, and later on in December of that year, claimed to have worked at Area 51 in the Area S4 region. 1989 would see Bob separate from his wife Tracy, a silhouetted interview with George Knapp, and the birth of what would become the legend of Bob Lazar. According to the Robert Lazar timeline by Tom Mayhood, on June 5, 1990, Robert Lazar was arrested in Las Vegas for pandering, and on June 18, 1990, Robert Lazar pled guilty to a felony charge of pandering in district court. According to the Las Vegas Sun, the guilty plea was part of a plea bargain in which the district attorney's office agreed not to pursue additional prostitution-related charges. The story in the Las Vegas Review-Journal said Robert Lazar met prostitute Toni Bullock as a customer and helped her set up her business in the Newport Cove apartments on Tamaras Street. The story also stated, the records show that Lazar later helped Bullock in setting up the business, that he did indeed keep computer records of customers, and that he also took at least a 50% share of her fees. Lazar was also interested in recruiting other women into the operation, the records state. August 20th, 1990 would be Robert Lazar's sentencing date. As a result of his pandering conviction, Bob Lazar was sentenced to 6 months probation, 150 hours of community service, ordered to undergo psychotherapy and to stay away from brothels. Something that has always stood out to me is that Lazar has actually grown tired of telling his story to the UFO community. Yet, when we head on over to his company's website, United Nuclear, where you can buy scientific equipment and supplies, an entire section is dedicated to selling Area 51 material down to signed posters, shirts, his autobiography, some mugs, you get the idea. If Bob's grown tired of retelling his story, why would he constantly remind himself of his past by having a shop directly linked to his incredible stories? Hell, Bob Lazar even almost became a movie star. An article from Variety would state that the life of former US government UFO scientist Bob Lazar, that was recently put into turnaround by Goober Peters Productions, has been put on an earthly fast track by New Line Cinema for director Chuck Russell, according to Michael DeLuca, New Line's exec VP CEO. New Line finalized the deal for the untitled film on Wednesday after Lazar considered competing offers from producer Steve Tisch, Simpson Brockheimer Productions, and actor Steven Seagal. DeLuca said the pick will have an $8 million to $10 million budget and will shoot in fall or early '94 with a '94 release. The movie ultimately went nowhere as far as I can tell, and even slated Matt Damon at one point to play the role of Bob Lazar. As time went on, Lazar's timeline hasn't been too interesting, keeping fairly quiet up until the release of Jeremy Corbell's documentary, which showed Lazar being raided by the FBI, and ultimately publicized his story for a newer generation on the Joe Rogan podcast. I can conclude for certainty that Bob Lazar was an actual pimp. Just kidding, kind of. The Bob Lazar story has left me with more confusion than answers. The more I listen to him and others talk about the man, the more they have me convinced of his credibility. That's not to say I'm also left with a couple of conclusions of my own. The first being Bob Lazar did in fact work at Los Alamos, but to what capacity is still left in question. Was he a physicist or an electrical engineer hired by Kirkmeyer? It does seem like numerous people saw him around the facility and seemed to be known as the jet engine car guy. The Los Alamos story checks out to some extent. The truthfulness of Bob Lazar's Area S4 story is the main question here. And while his story hasn't changed for over 30 years and has fascinating details down to the science of these alien craft, one flaw stands out to me the most. Let's ask Bob why he was fired from the back engineering project.
Part of the security clearance is that not only do you not have any connections to foreign countries and aren't a maniac, but you have to have a stable home life too. Well, she started having an affair with a flight instructor. Now, they were monitoring this on the phone, and they knew it, and I didn't. So they stopped me coming in, and their attitude at the time was, we need to see how this is going to play out, and if Lazar's going to get a little weird or anything. So,
if Bob Lazar was fired for having an unstable home life, why was he hired on to begin with? Given the supposed evidence of Bob's first marriage along with his financial mishaps, a background check for a secret government program would have unveiled Lazar's instability. But what about the details of these alien craft? Are we to question how he knows so much about these vehicles?
believe it or not, I'm not into UFOs. I don't follow stories or,
Even after your experiences?
No, I'm fascinated with the technology.
The fact Lazar claims he never cared about the UFO topic could be refuted by a video of Lazar talking about an old UFO photo looking like his coined sport model.
It looked like, if anyone's familiar with Billy Meyer's sightings, very astonishingly similar to that craft.
We also have to question whether or not he used his story for financial gain. The short answer is yes. There is clear evidence of him selling his story to New Line Cinema, and I'm sure he didn't appear on the Rogan podcast out of the goodness of his heart, or make Jeremy Corbell's documentary for free. Some money had to have been involved there. Plus, the selling of merchandise on his website about Area 51 is clear evidence that he used his story for some financial profit. But at the end of the day, what if Bob Lazar is telling the truth, and I'm just being the ass with speculations? What if the W-2 form claiming to be paid by the Department of Naval Intelligence isn't forged? What if he did really work at Area 51? And I'm completely wrong. What if the biometrics scanner was real and not just from Hollywood films? With recent government officials coming out exposing the truth behind UFOs, further propels the stories of Bob Lazar as being nothing but reality. And the moment his claims are validated will be the moment that I apologize for being skeptical in his story.